Hello, everyone. This is the latest in my series in the not too dismal science of economics. I'm Philip Strin, professor of economics at the University of Winnipeg. Today, I want to talk a little bit more about an issue from international trade, the economics of international trade. From almost daily, you could take an issue that has been raised by the Trump administration and incorporate it in a course in international trade theory. In the past lectures, I've talked about tariffs in a number of different ways. But today I want to talk about another issue that has been raised by the Trump administration, and it has to deal with the claim that regarding trade between Canada and the US, regarding the nature of the trade. Trump has said, what do we need Canada for? We make everything that they make. Now, in the history of trying to explain trade between the economic history in terms of explaining trade between countries, there has been a number of different theories that have put forth. Historically, the argument was that trade took place between countries based on what's called comparative advantage. And I think I've talked a little bit about that in a previous video. But in general, the comparative advantage means it is relatively cheaper for you to uh, if you have a comparative advantage in a product, it is relatively cheaper for you to produce it than to import it in terms of an opportunity cost sense. And usually that comparative advantage is based on differences, or the trade is based on differences in labor or factor endowments, capital and labor endowments, or differences in technology, or it could even be difference in climate, for example, if you're looking at tourism, trade and tourism. But there was also the puzzle about why countries which seem to have similar, what we call capital labor ratios or factor endowment ratios would still trade. So this is the issue that Trump administration has raised. For example, if you look at Canada and the US, obviously Canada is a much smaller country than the US. But if you looked at the ratio of capital to labor, it's probably fairly similar. And I know there have been estimates done, so I won't get into the technical details, but they are quite similar in terms of the nature of their economy. So the question is, why would you expect trade between Canada and the US? Well, in the 80s and the 90s, there was this theory that developed which said that basically one reason for trade is to take advantage of what you call scale economies. In other words, the lower costs that could be achieved by higher outputs. But that is largely a function of differences in uh, what's called a taste for variety. For example, let's think of the wine market. So if you like wine, obviously California produces wine, Ontario produces wine, BC produces wine. So the question is, why would there be trade between, say, Canada and the US in wine? Well, it's largely because consumers in both countries have a taste for what's called variety. In other words, they would like to consume a wider variety of products than is perhaps feasible to produce domestically. So that is really what's given rise between trade between countries, between Canada and the US, is that there's a taste for variety. Now, another argument is that, and it's related to the scale economies, is that you have firms in each country specializing in either a stage of production where they can produce a lot more for their own needs and then export the difference. And that happens on both sides of the border, and those inputs go into producing the final product. So that's what's called trade and intermediate products. So it's not a mystery why Canada and the US trade, even though they look like they have similar economies. It's because consumers in both countries value variety. And so as long as people value variety, they're going to have what's called might have considered a taste for imports. And if you only had one type of automobile, think of the old Model T Fords, then you would only have one production location of automobiles. Consumers would only be consuming one product. So it's the variety that gives rise to the trade. So in a sense, it's not a mystery. Now, obviously, if the US would shut off trade with Canada, then who would be harmed? Well, the consumers in the US who liked Canadian products would be harmed. Who would gain? Well, to the extent that consumers in the US would shift their purchases from Canadian imports to US produced goods, then they might gain. But in a sense, though, consumers will generally be worse off if their first best choice is not being realized. So that's really why this trade still takes place between Canada and the US. But also, Canada tends to have different endowments. Some of these endowments have been sort of man-made. If you think of the development of hydroelectricity, there's been a lot more relative development of hydroelectricity in, say, BC, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec than would be needed in some sense for their own needs. So obviously they have an export market. So who benefits? Well, US consumers and US industry who seek cheaper forms of energy benefit. So the benefits go both ways in terms of trade. But in general, it is quite an interesting issue that the US, since it's such a large economy, it could probably survive closer to a self-sufficiency or what's called an autarkic situation. But in general, the consumers who have a taste for variety and a taste for imported goods would be worse off. So if you have any comments about this video, and if you like it, give it a like. And so, as I say, these are interesting times, and I'll probably comment from time to time on these issues. Bye for now.